Alright, let's talk about skulls. Lots of skulls. An entire place of skulls. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we'll be talking about an actual book, and that is Golgotha by Lavie, Tidhar, which came out last week and is the third book in a trilogy that is sometimes called the Maror trilogy and contains, of course, Maror and Adama, which came out in 2022 and 2023, I think. I am somewhat confused about dates because time is meaningless. Anyway, it came out last week, I read it, I loved it, and I figured we might as well talk about it because I have also talked about both of these other books, and we'll do the usual thing in these cases. I'll give you a quick sort of like spoiler-free synopsis, rundown of what to expect, and then we move into a larger discussion of what is going on in this book that will contain spoilers. And because this is the third book in a more or less trilogy of, well, standalone novels that are tied together or linked together, I will also talk about stuff that happens in those other two books to frame all of those things together. Ready? Well, let's go. Alright, as I said, Golgotha is the third book in this trilogy, with Maror mostly covering the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and Adama mostly covering the time between 1946 and 1993, and in that regard we are moving further back, and this time around we have basically two linked stories, one of them taking place in Ottoman Palestine in 1882 and the other second half of the novel taking place in 1948, in the last week before the British Mandate is ended and the British leave British Mandate Palestine, and everything happened afterward, and everything that happened afterwards. So these are the two stories that build up Golgotha. So what can you expect from that? Well, the first one is a bit of an adventure story, treasure hunt of a Habsburg Empire person who is running around in Ottoman Palestine as a hired killer, more or less, for an Ottoman official, or at least someone in that regard, who is sent out to hunt down someone who stole something, and then adventures and treasure hunts through 1880s Palestine ensue, which if you have ever read any of those 19th century travel adventure stories, this may sound familiar, and it does kind of go down that direction. The second part, as I said, takes place in 1948 and focuses on one Burton, who is a police commander in the British police forces in Palestine. Those of you who have read Adama may remember Burton as a very, very small side character in the Ruth storyline in 1948 in 1946 still, and that is the other sort of part of this. And Burton is called to a break-in and robbery. Someone has been killed and a woman has vanished, and he is tasked to find that possibly abducted British citizen and bring her back before the British leave Palestine. So he has a couple of days, and the search that he goes on obviously takes him between the already fighting groups of Palestinians and Jews in Israel, and that is he's trying to get through between those two fronts and these two sides and get his final job done. And in that regard, it is it's a bit of a crime fiction story. It is also a war story, and it does, of course, tackle all the things that you might expect from that. Both stories are more or less coherent in themselves and closed in themselves. They have, but they are once again linked. There are characters that show up in both stories, and there are other characters in mostly the Burton part of the book that then link to Adama and Maror with characters and places and so forth. I think it's a really good book. You can see some of the experiences from last year's Six Lives. The sort of linked novella or short story is rapidly becoming one of, has always been something that Lavie Tidhar has been very fond of, and having a story set in Ottoman Palestine is, I think, really cool. the descriptions of the country are once again brilliant. The atmosphere is great. The plot is interesting enough. The question of treasure, obviously one that we've always looked at, in particular with that specific region. I mean, just look back to the first Indiana Jones movie. It's basically the same kind of sort of structure in a lot of ways, or like idea that there is some mystical buried treasure somewhere in the area of Palestine, and a lot of people want those treasures for specific reasons. That's the underlying thing. I think you should read this. I think you should also read Maror and Arama in that order, because I think that reverse chronological order does do some really interesting things. I highly recommend reading all three. They give you like a very interesting perspective on a place that is unfortunately in the news a lot these days. I'm trying to not get into like current politics, because this is a historical fiction that looks at historical roots of a lot of conflicts that still happen. So this is what I'm going to focus on, but I think it can add sort of like depth and understanding, or at least show some older elements of this specific place and this specific region, right? So that is what we're going to talk about further. So you should definitely go and read this. It's not that long. You can do so. If you've read both Maror and Adama, you already know the kind of story you're getting into. If not, they're historical novels that you should really read, because they're excellent and they show you sides and places and aspects of Israel and Palestine that you may not be aware of. So worth for that alone. Trigger warnings, there is some, obviously, this description of war crimes, because this is 1948 in some regard, and 1948 in Palestine is not necessarily a place where everyone is happy, to put it mildly. So there are descriptions of war crimes, if that is something that you struggle with. Yeah, this is going to be in here, and there's obviously a lot of violence in there as well, because we have hired killers and that kind of stuff. So that also happens in these books. But beyond that, I think they are worth reading. They're really fascinating. And as a trilogy, they're even more fascinating than each of those individually. And you go and read it. I'll have a bit of a drink, and then we'll talk about, spoilers and stuff. All right, let's talk about the spoilers. First of all, I want to look at the structure of the entire trilogy and where in that entire trilogy Golgotha fits in, and then we'll talk about some interesting aspects of the structure and what makes Golgotha stand out, and then we'll talk more about sort of like the content and so forth. So let's start with the trilogy. And I already mentioned this. It's interesting to have a trilogy of historical novels that move backwards in time, with Maror starting in the 1960s and Adama starting in the 1940s, and this one starting in 1882. So we're moving further back in time, and I appreciate that approach, because, mostly we go in chronological order when we have historical fiction trilogies or something like that, whether it is your Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel sort of stuff, or it is something more science fiction-y like the Baroque Cycle by Neil Stephenson. You still start in the past and move forwards. Maybe you'll get like a frame narrative where someone in the present sort of like goes back and remembers what happened in the past and so forth, but you usually start at the beginning and move to the end. What I appreciate especially, and I think it's helpful with a topic like, in a region like Israel and Palestine in particular, is to sort of go through this backwards in time, because it is obviously a place with a lot of history, a lot of complicated history throughout the millennia. People have been there for the longest fucking time, and so sort of like going through this more like a palimpsest, and like taking one layer of history and taking it apart, and then moving back one layer of history and taking that one apart, and then moving back a further layer of history and so forth, I think is a helpful approach, because it does show how many different groups, how many different empires have taken over and run and occupied and exploited and so forth this specific sort of like stretch of land. And I think in that regard it does work really well to sort of like open up that depth perception of Israel, Palestine, the Near East in that regard, because it's sometimes, especially with the current situation, the current genocide going on and all of that. We're focused on the present, which we should be when it comes to political action. But when you want to actually look at the history of a place, you need to sort of like be able to move back before, each of those wars, basically, one step further and further back into the past. And I think this trilogy does that wonderfully. It does also, and I think this is also helpful, separate out the different aspects of that history into 3 relatively distinct sort of like thematic blocks that also come with the history, I think, because if you look at Maror as the first book, or the most contemporary one, because it goes all the way to the like 19th and early 2000s, it very much is a crime fiction, and it very much focuses on the collaborations between organized crime, the military, and so forth in a society that is very nihilistic in a lot of ways, and is very much very pragmatic, very eager to take personal gains and so forth over any form of idea or idealism. It mostly ignores any form of idealism that was certainly there at the founding of the country of Israel in a lot of ways, right? It does very much ignore most of that. There's a scene with with a journalist when she talks to Golda Meir, and it's very much about like the death of idealism and what came afterwards and what comes afterwards, which is, well, nihilism and violence and corruption and crime and so forth. And that is what Maror focuses on, sort of like those elements of capitalism and realpolitik, or whatever you want to call it, right, in that regard. Whereas Adama, in a lot of ways, as the second book, focuses on that idealism in a lot of ways, the political idealism, with the focus on one family, on one kibbutz, the ideas of, kibbutz socialism, the socialist side, the very much non-religious socialist side of Zionism, the idea of building a new and better country in all kinds of ways, and how that is then also derailed over time through the inability, through trauma of Holocaust survivors and things like that. How those elements sort of, how that idealistic dream of a better country fails, whether it is through, as I said, the trauma of surviving the Holocaust, or having family members lost, having family members that cannot actually leave that traumatic experience behind, or whether it is because of, all the wars and the war crimes that are committed during the Nakba, or the War of Independence, depending on which side you're talking to, and how those things also cost a lot of blood, and how that trauma sort of like makes it very difficult to keep that dream alive and keep those idealistic visions alive, and how Israel as a country during the Cold War is slowly drifting away from the socialist side of things and drifting towards capitalist America, and how that, certainly doesn't help with any of these ideas and this idealism. So that is very much that death of that dream, I think, and the death of hope is very much a theme in Adama. So the question then is, of course, where do you go when you go one step before that? And that is where we are with Golgotha. And Golgotha, I think, does do some very interesting things. It's the first of these books that actually talks about, faith and religion in a lot of ways. Adama is very, while people obviously, celebrate Purim and say, Passover, Seder, and stuff like that, there is no religious characters. There are no religious characters, no true believers in Adama or in Maror, because in Adama they are, the main family is very clearly a socialist, Zionist, secular Zionist group, which, doesn't necessarily, that doesn't really work well with religion, as we all know, when you take your socialism, depending on where you are, seriously. And because everyone is just a nihilist, or not everyone, but most people are nihilists and just out for money and so forth in Maror. There is also no deeper thing with religion, although obviously Koan does constantly quote Bible verses or Old Testament verses. But there is no actual faith or religion in either one of these books. Golgotha, however, I would argue is taking on that third sort of element of Israeli identity, national identity, and so forth. And that is, of course, the religious, historic one, which is obviously why this is about searching the lost treasures of the Second Temple, which have both religious and historic significance if what you want to build is, well, a national identity on this being the homeland of, well, Jews since forever, and you need to tie that back to arguably Jewish history, or historiography, which is the Old Testament in a lot of ways, or the Torah. So that is, I think, these three parts. Like, you have the political idealism in Adama, you have the capitalist nihilism in Maror, and you have the more mystic religious aspect in Golgotha. And I think splitting it up in these three elements, into these like three books in these three elements, I think is helpful for sort of like unwinding the mix of all these different elements that make up history and identity in Israel and Palestine. So I think that is really good, like interesting as a structural element for like a trilogy, both moving backwards in time and looking at these different aspects of politics, history, and events one after the other. All right, now let's actually focus on Golgotha and the two parts. As I said, that there's like one part in the 1882 part, the stranger, the German one, or Austrian. Well, he comes from the Habsburg Empire, so I guess it must be Austrian or Austro-Hungarian. It's never fully, mentioned because he just goes by either the name Gustav or the foreigner and so forth. And then obviously Burton's part in the 1948 part. So what is interesting here is, I think, that we have two dying empires, right? The first part, in 1882, is, of course, the end of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire occupying Palestine for the longest time. In like the 1880s, that is past both the Crimean War and it is past the Russian-Turkish-Ottoman wars. The Ottoman Empire is being basically dismantled by European countries that are propping up the Ottoman Empire at the time. There's a lot of politics that we don't necessarily need to get into here, but what it shows is that people from Western Europe, both Germans and French people, Germans, French, and British people, are streaming into Palestine and are practically able to do whatever they want at that point, because the Ottoman sort of like power and control over Palestine has dropped away in a lot of ways. So we see one important element here, which is that this area has always been occupied by one empire after another. We have these steps forward, backwards in time when it's like, well, there's a Roman Empire. There's obviously, before that, the Hellenistic empires were there. And afterwards, there has always been some external force taking over that country for whatever reasons. In this case, it's the Ottomans slowly fading away, and with different elements, different groups from Europe taking over the place. You have the Templars, in this case, obviously the German Templar movement being a Christian movement that has nothing to do with the Knights Order of the Templars, and them coming there to take over the Holy Land, to try to convince Jews to convert Jews to Christianity. You have British tourists going on tourism sprays and just like going to visit all these amazing biblical sites, and just to have seen them. You have some people that are there as pilgrims, and you have the beginnings of Jewish Zionism also coming there to possibly establish a new Jewish homeland, because this is the beginning of political Zionism in the 19th century. And I think that's sort of like weirdly you can't fully call it lawless, but relatively, under very little control, where people from the West can basically do whatever the fuck they want because of all these contracts that Germany and Britain and France made with the Ottomans. They are untouchable by Ottoman law in a lot of ways, and that allows them to behave pretty badly in a lot of ways. And what I find interesting with this is, this may just be like a very specifically German thing, but like one of those German authors is, of course, Karl May, and he wrote both like travel adventure stories set in the American West, but also in the dying Ottoman Empire, and having a German character who goes by some pseudonyms and so forth, and has adventures, finding treasures and so forth in in Palestine feels very much sort of part and parcel of that narrative tradition, which I grew up reading some of those as a kid, and I might still talk about them in a different book. But it showcases how this place has always been exploited for different ideas by different countries, and having serious Christian missionaries basically there, at the same time as you have obviously Christians that have always lived there, and you have always had Jews living there, you've always had Palestinians living there, you have some Ottomans there, like you have a society that is being slowly colonized through different means, both like force and commerce and religion and so forth at the same time, and that will lead to further conflict. And I think that is interesting to see portrayed there. And of course, the idea of a national identity. Now, I think it's important to look at this. It's the 19th century, which is the time where a lot of places develop national mythologies, national identities, and so forth. The idea of trying to find your own like ancestors, places, whether it's ruins, whether it's mythologies, and all of those kind of things, is something that happens in the late 18th and early 19th century, all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, all over Europe. Whether it is your Ossian forgeries to develop like a Scottish national mythology and identity, whether it's your Kalevala in Finland to develop like a Finnish national identity, whether it is German Romanticism and German ideas about German national identity, history, and trying to tie it back to like Germanic ruins and so forth. All of these, it's a general movement. So the idea of Zionism in that regard, I think, it's helpful to see it as a similar idea of finding both a homeland and developing a national identity, because that is not something that we have before that. Like the idea of the nation state is, of course, an invention of mostly the 19th century. So going to Palestine and trying to find archaeological proof for some of those mythologies, some of those histories that are tied to Jewish identity in the Old Testament is, of course, part of that same international sort of program of developing that national identity in a lot of ways. And that is something that we see with Hoffman and, that map for the treasure of the Second Temple, because if you find all of that would, of course, do a lot of that. Unfortunately, it also already shows this idea of, Palestine and whatever becomes of it being sort of like having all these different groups having claims on it or trying to make claims on it, because you have Christian mystics who also want to do that. Like part of the program, of course, of the Templars is to, convert the Jews living in Palestine to Christianity, because of that very specific apocalyptic millenarian idea that the Jews in Palestine need to convert, they need to congregate there, and then they need to be, at least parts of them need to be converted to Christianity to, reach the rapture, the end of days, and all of that, the second coming. And that apocalyptic idea is also strong in the 19th century. You have a lot of like apocalyptic millenarian cults throughout the 19th century that basically expect the second coming any day now. And that is, once again, we see stuff that is happening today with, Christian Zionism, biblical architecture, archaeology, and all of that stuff, which is currently funded mostly by evangelical Christian far-right groups from mostly the US. That program has been around for a long time, and in this case, it's also beginning in that time zone, during that time where the Western forces had first had access to Palestine and were able to take whatever they feel they want and need out of it, whether it's just tourism or serious religious convictions or whatever. So we see all of that kind of show up in the 19th century there, which I think makes it such an essential part of that trilogy to see this idea of mystic and mysticism in a lot of ways, religious mysticism, and the questions like whose mysticism are we actually talking about here, right? And all of that, works really well in the 19th century, in that 19th century story, because it has more of an adventure story feeling. Yes, people die, people get killed and so forth, but it's before the invention, or at least the broad spreading of machine guns or anything of the sort. So it has that weird adventure story vibe of violence where people will shoot at each other, but with single shots and so forth. And I think Tidhar captures that really well without, shying away from the fact that it's still violence and it's still exploitation, whether it's, the British tourists that behave like shit, or the German missionaries that try to force their form of Christianity on everyone, or whether it's some of the early Zionist migrants coming from Europe that try to start their form of communal living, basically what turns into the kibbutzim movement later on, because those are also outsiders, and that idea of settlers and colonialism that takes over a country that has, while being a part of the Ottoman Empire, still was sort of mostly the place of people that had lived there for a long time under, foreign rule, but nothing more, being now colonized by different groups with different motivations in different ways from the outside. And that change in imperialism, I think, is what we can see here. So that is the first dying empire. And then we move on to 1948 and the death of another empire, that being the British one. And what is interesting here, I think, with Burton is, of course, once again, he is the lover of Ruth in the 1946 part of Adama, and there are some other connections. One of his deputies is, of course, Cohen, father of Cohen, that being, obviously the main focus character of Maror, and his father also quotes Bible verses, which interesting to have sort of this character basically be very similar to the later Cohen. There is certainly some symbolism there that I don't want to get too deeply into, but there is something interesting there, and we see sort of the death of that form of military imperialism that Britain in a lot of ways practiced until the 1940s and 1950s, and obviously that's the time when India becomes independent, a lot of African colonies become independent over time during that time, and we see how that specific form of ending imperialism and just leaving has left, leads to all kinds of violence. And obviously Israel-Palestine is one version of that, but when you go to different, say, African colonies that Britain just left without, taking particular care of what will happen afterwards, that also led to a lot of civil wars, violence, and so forth. So we see how a place that has been basically ruled through violence and just subjugated by force. If you leave without anything else, then violence will be the result. You don't need to read your Frantz Fanon to understand that. So I think that is an interesting aspect to see, sort of how those two different empires, the Ottoman and the British Empire, how they ruled or did not rule the place, and how they are leaving. One of them relatively, you can't call it benign, but in a less violent way, versus the British leaving while the war between Palestinians and Jews is in full go already, right? That's during that last week. The British basically have no power left. They're just trying to keep up appearances to save face, and that's all there is to it. Which is why Burton's job is just to find Eva. I think Eva is her name. I might just have lost her name. Feynman. Yes. So to just find her, because we can't lose a British citizen. We don't care about anything else. And seeing all of that, I think, is interesting in its own way, because once again, it shows how this is a place that all kinds of external forces have always tried to take as much out of as they want, without any regard to the people that already lived there. Now, what we also see through those flashbacks and so forth is, of course, how during the 1930s, during that time, the British did in fact train a lot of people, both Palestinians and mostly Jews, to use them during World War II in a lot of ways. And that's where, Ord Wingate, noted psychopath, mass murderer, war criminal, and absolute psychopath, gets his short appearance, because you can't just leave a character like that off the book, I guess. But that shift, I think, is interesting, because it once again does focus on colonial violence that is, and imperial violence that is something that has happened there all the time. and what is implied up to a point, at least, is that what will happen afterwards is just the same thing, which with one group taking over after the British, once again through violence and occupying the entire country. Once again, through violence, because that is the language that is spoken at this point. And you can look at, reasons why people are doing this and so forth. But Golgotha does not do that, which I think is a good approach. It just shows that that is exactly what happens, because violence is sort of like the one thing that always happens in that situation. So I did appreciate the way the Burton story unfolds there, when it starts like basically as a crime fiction thing that then moves into that war crime part. We see the murdering of prisoners, which is obviously a war crime, and all of those things. And once again, it goes back to the idea of finding that lost treasure. In this case, with people like Moshe Dayan and so forth, looking for it, because at this point, the religious or spiritual or mystical element that was still there with like Hoffman in like the 1880s has fully become subsumed and taken over by the political ambitions and the political means. Because if you have a nation state and you can in fact base it on historic evidence and prove that you have been there all along and much longer than others, then you can use that as a political weapon. And that is exactly what religion has become at that point. I think it's important to look at it that way, how faith and religion that has always been there is something that political forces can use. Now, obviously, we live in a time right now where it may or may not be the other way around, where certain religious groups are taking over politics, but that connection, I think, is still there, and it is still very interesting to see that tied together in the Burton story. Now, before we end this, I wanted to talk about like 2 or 3 final things. One of them is, of course, the Garden Eden motive. Remember, all the way back in Maror, there's a scene where Avi, after taking drugs, sits in a garden and talks with a snake, a serpent. Now, that's obviously a motif that you may have encountered in the past somewhere, right? So that is nice, and it does get also, it gets picked up here in Golgotha near the end, when Burton and Iva are fleeing, and they find this piece of garden which is just a small abandoned place with one apple tree in it, and they go in and they go out and they can't find it again, and it is that place that has been walled in, and I think as a symbol that is very powerful, this idea that there is potential there is potential there for peace, there is potential there for a form of paradise, whatever that means, as a symbol, but because of building walls around, because of fighting around it all the time, it has basically been lost and forgotten. And that is, as symbols go, it's nice to have that come back, and having these ideas, these slightly, I don't want to call them supernatural, sort of, I think, come back throughout the series, I think does add a dimension, because there is always that mythical atmosphere sort of like hovering behind, because people can't let it go. And the question is like, if we have to base these things on myth, what myth do we choose, right? And that is where I want to go to the final part, which is, of course, the knife and Eve. See, throughout this book in particular, Golgotha, both the stranger, Gustav, and then Burton have, for a while, have that Neolithic knife, or possibly Paleolithic. I'm not good with those dates, but probably Neolithic stone knife, and that gives them flashbacks to a place of skulls, but also to a woman, and that woman, as we know from the prologue, is called Eve, and she is a Neanderthal who lives together with Homo sapiens, whatever version, the modern human, I guess, in this case, because there is archaeological evidence for that. There was a colony of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens cohabiting in the area of Mount Carmel in Haifa, I guess, and that idea, I think, is really interesting, because the knife, as we know, is one that she uses to skin a rabbit in this case, or deer skin, or clean a deer skin, but like it's a domestic tool, but it has been turned into a weapon by both, or is seen as a weapon both by Gustav and Burton, and that idea of like having that place where people could live together, cohabit together, different people could cohabit together in the past, which I guess is paradise in one way or another, and with Eve being there, which obviously would make her husband, or whatever you want to call it, her man, well, Adam, I guess. So having the idea of paradise being there, being a place where people from different backgrounds can live together peacefully, and having that all twisted by the knife being seen not as a domestic tool, but then as a weapon, that does say a lot of like how history and mythology and imagination and religion and faith and all of these things can be twisted if by people who are unable to see, well, the alternative. Because if we look at things another way, then there might be other options. Now, does the idea of peaceful cohabitation sound incredibly unrealistic in the year 2025? Yes, of course. Absolutely. But it does still, I think, it is still important to understand that there was always the option of going another direction. There was always the idea of this could be better. There is a chance for peaceful living together and so forth. And if it's only in those imaginary texts and in those elements, then that is incredibly frustrating and depressing, but at least it is still mentioned somewhere. And I think having it tied back to that beginning, because it used to be sort of that way, I guess, I found really moving and really powerful in that regard. And yeah, I really appreciated all of that. So yeah, these are my thoughts on Golgotha by Lavie Tidhar. I hope you read it. I hope you also read Maror and Arama. I have videos for all of those. You should go and read those 3 books. If you have read them, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like, subscribe. I don't know, join the Patreon if you feel like it. Join the channel if you feel like it. Mostly read this book and talk about this book. When I picked it up last Thursday when it came out, I was the first person on Goodreads to leave a rating, which is insane to me for a mainstream publisher published book, right? This is published by Bloomsbury, right? We're not talking by nothing else, a small thing, but apparently no one has talked about it. No one has read it. No one is talking about it. And I understand there are, what with politics being what they are right now, maybe people are a bit reluctant to pick up a book with that topic, but I highly recommend you do, and maybe talk about it, because it deserves to be, be known about, and people deserve to know about it, and it's up to us to do that. So I don't know. Read the book, talk about it. Beyond that, be good people, and I'll see you in the next one. And until then, thanks and cheers.